Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the RSIS webinar, The World After November the 5th, International Security Implications of US Domestic Political Trends by Dr. Adam Garfinkle. My name is Adrian Ang. I am the Research Fellow and Coordinator of the US program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Before I introduce Dr. Garfinkle, just one little bit of housekeeping. Dr. Garfinkle will be speaking for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So please use the Q&A function to submit any questions or comments you might have for Dr. Garfinkle. So with that out of the way, let me introduce today's speaker, Dr. Adam Garfinkle, who was Distinguished Visiting Fellow at RSIS from 2019 to 2021. Dr. Garfinkle was also founding editor of the American Interest magazine and served previously as both executive editor and editor of the National Interest. Dr. Garfinkle also served in 2003 to 2005 as speechwriter to the Secretary of State, before which he held appointments as professorial lecturer in American foreign policy at RSIS, Johns Hopkins. He has also taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Haverford College, and other institutions of higher learning. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Adrian. I guess it's kind of nice to be back. It's been about 5 months, I think, since we did this before. I'm going to try to speak for 30 to 35 minutes, but I don't know if I will succeed because I had a lot of trouble trying to organize my thoughts because a lot's gone on in the past 5 months. And I actually committed my remarks to a text, but I did that for a reason that had nothing to do with the complications of the actual subject, but rather because it's past my bedtime. And if in Washington here, it's past my bedtime. And if I don't have a text, Lord knows what might happen to my train of thought. So without further ado, I will start. And, if I have to look down to my text, I hope I don't irritate anybody, but my face is nothing special to look at anymore. So it shouldn't bother anyone, at least I hope. I want to what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to speak in sort of three sections. I'm going to start with some of the data points that are before us right now that concern the transition from the Biden administration to the second Trump administration, and a few of the details that have come out lately that I think express certain characteristics worth knowing about the incoming regime, the incoming administration. And then we're going to spread a little bit further and talk a little bit about American domestic policy and domestic political culture and the certain circumstances that it finds itself here in early 2025, because I don't think you can understand anything about American foreign policy and about the implications for the global security commons without understanding where it comes from. And where it comes from is U.S. domestic political culture. There is in international relations and in academic international relations, there's this school of thought called academic realism. And one of the principles, at least but when this was first introduced as an academic thing, one of the principles of it was that domestic politics and foreign policy had no relationship to one another, and that you could learn anything you really needed to know about foreign policy behavior from power vectors and so forth. And a fellow named Arnold Wolfers helped make this famous with the so-called billiard ball model of international relations. And I really think anybody who's ever been in government, especially at a relatively high level, get a good view of how things really happen, knows that this is not realism. This is the most unrealistic way I ever heard to understand how foreign policy gets made, at least in the United States, and I think in any great power. Maybe small powers, dependent and weak powers, really are sandwiched in by their literal circumstances. But a great power has a certain amount of leisure in what it may and may not do, and it really flows from it's a projection of domestic political culture and events, and also institutions. So we have to talk a little bit about the peculiar place of American domestic policy right now. I mean, political culture, or there's really nothing. There's no basis to talk about the foreign policy, the international security policy, and what the lateral consequences might be. So I think that's what that's the way to approach a subject like this. You start with the details and the facts before you, and then you try to reach back and understand, why things have developed the way that they have. And once you do that, then you can project forward carefully, tentatively. But I think that's the way you go about a subject like this. And if there are any students out there, the method of my hopefully not madness might be of some use to you in how you go about framing a talk like this. So let me start with a kind of a prolegomena about what I think about the situation, just to make it clear, what my biases are. We in less than a week from today, we will have a convicted felon inaugurated as president of the United States. That's never happened before. Maybe it should have happened before, but it never happened before. Had Donald Trump not won the election on November 5th, he would likely by now be a multiple felon, and he might even be in jail. Worse, if that's possible, we have a man who was responsible in January 2021 for the first peaceful power transition failure in the United States since 1861. And there is simply no doubt, at least in my mind, that Trump knew he lost the election in 2020, lied about it, ordered others to lie about it, summoned a mob, and pointed it to the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. This was an attempted coup, nothing less. And people were killed as a result of it. His own vice president could very well have been killed on that day. And President Trump didn't seem to care very much. Now, of course, the coup failed, as we all know. But the number of adult Americans who claim to believe the big lie about the 2020 election, or are somehow agnostic about it or tired of it, has never much abated for all that time since then. That is what designer infospheres, ideological echo chambers in the digital age can do. But failure did not daunt Trump. The MAGA brain trust had prepared another massive and far better plan, Stop the Steal, Big Lie 2.0, for post-November 5th, 2024, had Trump again lost. And in a way, Americans are very lucky that he won, because at the very least, it saved the nation from almost certain protracted turmoil and both organized and semi-organized violence on a scale probably much larger than we saw on January 6th, 2021. But he did win. And he won 49.89% of the vote, according to the data anybody can look up. So he managed somehow to turn January 6th, 2021 right on its head. It was not an insurrection aimed at a coup to prevent certification of an election result. It is now believed by an astonishing number of Americans to have been a patriotic, pro-democratic uprising against a deep state Democratic Party plot to steal the election. And those jailed for breaking the law since then will soon be released from jail by presidential pardon and will become MAGA heroes, as they already are, and called freedom fighters by many. Now, let me try to be clear as I can here about what I think of this. What the January 6th committee has showed, and now special counsel Jack Smith's report on the matter is public as of this morning, as of about 12 hours ago. So I haven't read it yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. What it showed is, and I quote the January 6th Commission, that Trump engaged in an unprecedented criminal effort to overturn the legitimate results of the election in order to retain power, close quote. Now, anybody who doubts the truth of that statement, after judge after judge, court after court, throughout every single legal objection Trump's lawyers made in the aftermath of November 2020, including several judges, by the way, that Trump had appointed himself. Anybody who doesn't believe the truth of that basic statement is, to my mind, not living in the real world. And people not living in the real world are by definition delusional and are not to be trusted with power over others. But power over others, and not just Americans, Trump and his associates will have soon, nuclear weapons and all. Of course, Trump tried to suppress the release of the Smith report, but he challenged none of the actual findings in it. Neither did his lawyers. The findings are based on interviews with more than 250 individuals, grand jury testimony from more than 55 witnesses, and evidence from searches of numerous electronic devices, euphemistically called. Uh, when Trump failed to suppress the report, uh, he called Smith in a tweet or a message just this morning, lame-brained and deranged and more. You really should read the whole thing, read the statement, and try to remember its tone as time passes, because it is very likely an honest talisman of many things to come. Trump has managed to drag the entire country down the rabbit hole into a surrealist hallucination. Some of us know we're down there now. A lot of Americans, however, haven't got the memo yet. And that is where American politics right now are. They're in a very, very strange place. Actually, like no place I can think of in the entire history of the Republic, going back to the ratification of the Constitution in 1789. And Americans have thought a lot of strange things and done a lot of strange things in 1789, but nothing quite matches the enveloping madness of a very substantial part of the American electorate and what it believes right now. Now, having got that off my chest, so you know exactly where I stand on these kinds of questions, like I said, we're going to start small and then get larger. So let's talk about the transition, some of the aspects of the transition. So all or nearly all of Trump's proposals for national security, which is to say Schedule C in the American lingo, choices for cabinet positions and for agency heads are unqualified or worse. Tulsi Gabbard is absolutely the worst. She is the member of a crypto Hindu cult in Hawaii that is rabidly anti-Muslim and who has mumbled pro-Russian and in the past even pro-Assad propaganda. All of them, except maybe for Mario Rubio at the State Department, are actively hostile to the missions of their own departments and agencies. And they are hostile to the civil servants and all the other Schedule A personnel in them, which is why those folks are now leaving the government in droves, while a few are practicing to be moles against the opportunity to later bear strategic leaks. And I have a feeling that this administration is going to leak a lot. They all do, but this one I think is really going to leak because there's bad blood, not just between Schedule C and Schedule A types in the future, but there's bad blood among people in the administration. There's a huge cleavage already, as we can see, between one group of advisors who loves the idea of H-1B visas and another group that hates the idea of H-1B visas. So they're already squaring off between what you would call the would-be techno-feudalists of the new administration led by Elon Musk and the more traditional MAGA anti-immigration types who have a very different view of the whole thing. There's a lot of cleavage inside the administration, and it's not clear to me that it can live together for very long, or that Donald Trump knows how to deal with it. It could be quite noisy, at least in the beginning, and maybe not just in the beginning. But nevertheless, let's go back to the transit. So one of the things that Trump mentioned was that he didn't want to put his nominees through any security clearance ordeals. And of course, the reason is obvious. He thinks that the IC, the intelligence community, and those who would vet people for security clearances are part of the deep state. So they are, by definition, enemies. So the problem with that in a transition is that the people who hold the positions right now can't even talk to the new guys because they are not cleared. They don't have security clearances to hear what they have to say. So for the first couple of weeks after the election, the so-called transition process was pretty much frozen. Nothing was going on. In the last couple of weeks, at least at lower levels, there has been some improvement on that, but it's nothing like the gold standard. It's nothing like a normal transition. We've not seen anything like this in my lifetime ever, despite the partisanship that always comes with one party replacing another, at the head of the government. This is unique. There's never been a transition process quite like this one. In addition, Trump at a certain point mooted the possibility of running Senate confirmation hearings for his nominees. It doesn't seem to be the case now, because I guess he thinks that most of them, possibly all of them, will in fact be confirmed. But in the past, in the first administration, if you remember, what he did when he had trouble with things like this was he created acting secretary. There were, I think, 2 acting secretaries of defense at one point, and acting this and acting that. And so if one of the nominees is not confirmed by the Senate, One tack that he can take is simply not to nominate anybody else to replace them, and simply call the failed nominee the acting director pending another nomination, which might take weeks or months or maybe years. Who knows? Uh, Trump does not particularly care one way or the other about that. The problem is that, for example, with the Secretary of Defense, if you only have an acting Secretary of Defense, there's certain statutory things he cannot do that a confirmed Secretary of Defense can do. So it kind of weakens the leadership of the department, but it makes the whole affair a lot more convivial to Trump's personal peccadillos. So we'll see where that goes. Meanwhile, the big news about the transition is that a few days ago, I don't know if this news has gotten to Singapore, the National Security Advisor designate Mike Waltz basically fired everybody on the National Security Council staff. He basically said, "We don't want you to go home." Which means on the 20th of January, after the day after or the 21st, the day after the inauguration, there really won't be a whole lot of people in the West Wing of the White House at the National Security Council office in the old executive office building. They'll all be fired. Meanwhile, Michael Anton at Policy Planning at the State Department, where I used to work, and I think probably Waltz too, they've basically decided to create a kind of a loyalty oath uh, to vet detailees, both to Policy Plan, the FSOs, Foreign Service officers who will be seconded up to policy planning on the 7th floor, and all the people from the various agencies and departments who would normally fill National Security Council spots in the White House. They have to say that they believe that the 2020 election was stolen by the Democrats and that Trump won the election rightfully. They have to actually attest to that. I think in writing, in the case of Anton, they have to attest to that so that they can get their jobs. Now, think what this means. Uh, if Waltz had just said, "I'm firing you all because we need people who are loyal to the new president," and that's a reasonable thing. It wouldn't be the first time something like that has happened. It wouldn't be the first time people outside the government were brought into the NSC to do various tasks. Clinton did that. You know, that's okay. It's happened before. But to say that you're going to politicize the entire process of choosing detailees instead of choosing them by merit, which is the gold standard and the way that things typically work for these kinds of things. That's how the interagency works in the United States. What you're doing is you're basically saying to anybody who might have wanted to come to the NSC from state or DOD or from the intelligence community or from Treasury or from Justice, you're basically saying to them, if you sign that oath, you attest that the 2020 election was stolen and you're on with the big lie, then if this administration ever ends and there's a Democratic or just some normal administration that follows it, you don't have a chance. Your career is dead if you do that. All right. And there's a kind of selection bias that goes along with a lot of people who would say those kinds of things to get a job in this administration. Um, uh, I mean, it's sort of troublesome uh, to think what kind of folks are going to be there, and what kind of credibility they might have with their departments, with the Defense Department, civilians and military people, and State Department. I mean, how's the interagency going to work with this political process when people back at Foggy Bottom or back at the Pentagon don't trust the people who are sitting on the NSC? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine how the interagency can function in a situation like this. So I'm just watching and waiting to see how they work this out. But there's never been anything like this, so there's no precedent for understanding how it's going to go forward. Um, uh, Let me now move on to. Oh, and by the way, just one more point on this. Now, I don't know Mike Waltz, but I know his deputy, Alex Wong, from when I worked at the State Department during Bush 43 administration as a Schedule B hire, not A or C. And neither one of them are nuts or fanatics or crazy. And I don't think either one of them believes the big lie. So the question becomes, what are they doing there? What do they think they're doing, being National Security Advisor and Deputy National Security Advisor? And I don't know, but I can speculate from my own experience. And that is that, a lot of people in this business like to be big shots. They like to get the better jobs. That's pretty normal. And also many believe that they are there, but for the grace of God and sanity, go them. I mean, they may think that what they're going to do is damage limitation. They're going to constrain or restrain the worst instincts of the president and those immediately around him. Because after all, that's what John Bolton thought he was doing in the first term. That's what J.R. McMaster thought he was doing that's what General Kelly thought he was doing in the first term. And they did, in fact, restrain and limit the damage that the first Trump administration did, not least, for example, to the NATO alliance. They didn't limit it as much as they could, and eventually their capacity to limit it sort of ran out and they had to leave. But this is different. I mean, in the first Trump administration, there were a lot of normies still in the Republican Party. There are fewer and fewer normies in the Republican Party. Also, now Trump has both the House and the Senate and the courts, including the Supreme Court, basically in his pocket and on his side. He now has also a renewed and a larger Democratic mandate on the basis of the election. So he feels like he can pretty much do what he wants. He also has a Supreme Court a decision from July 1st that basically creates immunity from anything he might do wrong. So he is pretty much unchained. And I wonder how much Mike Waltz or Alex Wong or anybody else I may know, I wonder how much damage limitation they're going to be able to do, especially when they're sitting right next door to people who actually have drunk the Kool-Aid, believe the big lie, and think that they're part of a major revolutionary insurrection, a patriotic insurrection in the history of the United States. So I'm just going to watch this really closely and see, what's going on. But the truth of the matter is, the people that are real, the true believers there, the Michael Antons of the world, many others, they don't really think there's going to be a non-MAGA administration anymore. They think that this insurgent revolution is permanent. They think they've turned a major page in the history of the United States. And I want to quote for you something that the president-elect said on July 27th of last year. He urged the Turning Point Action's Believers Summit audience to go vote. And here is what he said, and I'm quoting Trump: "You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians." Close quote. Now, that's quite a quote. You could look it up if you don't believe that I'm quoting it right. Now, I don't think most Trump voters on November 5th voted for this. All right. And we don't have time to autopsy why the election turned out the way that it did. We'd be here until next Thursday. But Trump's understanding of his mandate, I believe, is aptly described as a kind of Brezhnev doctrine. Once MAGA, always MAGA. Never go back. BAM. BAM stands for, if you know your 60s vocabulary, by any means necessary. Any means necessary, from lawfare to civil warfare, if necessary. And Trump is now in a position that he wasn't in 8 years ago to create what amounts to a paramilitary force based on the folks who are about to be sprung from jail after the inauguration. And the people who are working for him don't think there's going to be a post-MAGA world. And that's why I think what we've seen on November 5th might be aptly described, at least tentatively, as an elected coup. The violent coup in January 2021 didn't succeed, but this one maybe did. We'll see. There are a couple of boxes to check before one can really say that authoritatively. But if that were to happen, it wouldn't be a new thing. It has happened in the past, as indeed it's so often that it's a phenomenon that's been captured in literary resonances. Let me quote for you from Umberto Eco's novel, The Prague Cemetery, from 2016. He put these words in the mouth of his character Joly, who is speaking of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's 1852 transformation of France's short-lived Second Republic into an empire. And here is what Eco puts into the mouth of his character. "Tyranny, you understand, has been achieved thanks to universal suffrage. The scoundrel has carried out an authoritarian coup d'etat by appealing to the ignorant mob. This is a warning to us about the democracy of tomorrow." Close quote. And if you think that was an accident, a couple of pages later, Eco put these words into the mouth of another one of his characters. And here he used the key word illiterate. Quote, "Those who read books were already Republicans by nature, and those who supported the dictator were illiterate peasants who'd been granted universal suffrage by the grace of God." A little bit of sarcasm there, close quote. And the same idea also appears with reference to modern Turkey. So, for example, Ozi Livaneli put it very bluntly. Democracy in a country where the public is uneducated is no different from having a dictatorship or an elected king, close quote. And this is what Silvio Berlusconi did not so long ago in Italy. He used information power. He bought all the newspapers, right, to get elected, and then he put himself above the law. And that is what Americans have done now. They have elected the equivalent of a dictator, a magnifico, whose attitude toward the rule of law and any legal constraints on him personally is pretty much identical to Berlusconi's, as best I can tell. Now, Echo's reference to illiterate peasants is actually quite important because I define right-wing populism in the United States, and to a lesser degree in other Western democracies, as the mass mobilization in a mass democracy, an electoral democracy, mass mobilization beyond the rational apathetic norm of a mass that falls below the mean of deep literacy. And I'm going to talk about deep literacy in a minute or two, because if you don't understand what's going on with literacy and a post-literate society, you can't understand American domestic political culture nowadays. It's absolutely necessary. So now it may be an exaggeration to say that what happened on November 5th amounted to a democratically elected coup. Trump elected by a plurality, but not an absolute majority of the popular vote. And it may or may not be that we don't know how many of the people who voted for Trump fall below the mean of deep literacy, although I suspect a lot. But we're bound to find out if I and others are afflicted with what people have called the Trump derangement syndrome, if in fact, if in fact in 2026, during the midterms, if the Democrats surge back and they win the House and the Senate back because of a drag of opposition to the Trump administration's behavior, they might be prevented by lawfare and threats of literal coercion from even taking their seats. Now, that's an extraordinary thing to say. Do I think that's actually possible? I actually do think that's possible. Probable? I don't know. Possible? I do think that's possible. And if that happens, then people will look back in retrospect to November 5th, 2024, and see it as an extinction event, basically, for U.S. liberal democracy, with all that portends for global security and the normative order of the world. So that's the end of the stuff that I wanted to say about the transition in the election. And now what I want to talk about is why is American politics, why is American political culture in the strange state that it's in, that it would elect a man like this, not just once, but now twice, president of the United States. What's happened basically is that we, the people, to use the phrase that one finds in the Declaration, we've reelected a man who has lied and lied to turn reality upside down to suit his interests. And more to the point, since politics is downstream of culture, we need to know what's happened in American culture to allow something like this to happen. We've moved from a pre-enlightenment we've moved to a pre-enlightenment zero-sum, only winners and losers, law of the jungle, kind of Randian way of thinking about political life, from an enlightenment, positive sum way of thinking about political order and political life that could not be more different. They could not be more different from one another. How's this happen? And we, the people, did this, right? No foreigners made us do anything like this. Is all homemade. All this stuff is homemade. How did this happen? Well, I've written a book on this subject called The Age of Spectacle, and I could gobble up many hours talking about it, and I would love to, but I won't. I'll simply read you the book's subtitle. And from that, I think you'll be able to get at least a glimmer of the kind of argument, the kind of everything bagel, unified field theory argument I am trying to make. Here's the subtitle: Age of Spectacle, How a Confluence of Fragilized Affluence, the End of Modernity, Deep Literacy Erosion, and Shock Entertainment Tech Novelty has wrecked American politics. Now, I have a Substack called The Raspberry Patch, and it's free. And I've been rolling out The Age of Spectacle week by week for quite a while now. And I've got 8.5 of the 10 chapters out there. And to understand my argument, anybody can read this if you want. To understand my argument, which is a complex one, admittedly, requires an investment of time and energy. But if you do invest that time and energy, I honestly believe you will get better answers to these portentous questions than are available elsewhere. A lot of the pieces of my thesis are not original to me, but what I've done is I've put it all together in a way that I don't think anybody else has. And I'm pretty much persuaded that I've got something here. So I invite anybody who wants to go further into this, to just, check out the Substack and start reading. Now, let me try to summarize my argument, though, in just a couple of sentences, hard as it is, and frustrating as it is. So we have experienced in the United States in the past couple of decades what I call a mentality paradigm shift. We've gone from a modern, and I'm defining these words very carefully in the manuscript. We've gone from a modern Enlightenment-born mentality to a postmodern, post-Enlightenment one, from developmentalism to spectacle. And again, I define these words very carefully. The shift has three main precursors I've already alluded to. The advent of an unprecedented but recently fragilized affluence, and I mean plutocratized, net effect. I can't explain this now. Plutocratized affluence that's created more instability in the economy and more inequality in the economy. The end of modernity is the second precursor, what I also call the pluralization and decay of America's mythopoetical core. It's just a fancy word for saying that we've lost our stories. We don't tell the stories of our origin anymore, and the stories of credit and blame that come with the stories of origin. They've been switched out for other kinds of stories. And then third, the erosion of deep literacy, combined with what I call the new orality that has been sired by the digital age and the gadgets of the digital age. These three precursors, taken together, describe what I call the contradictions of liberal democracy. And I've done this, if you know your literature here, I've done this off a famous 1970 book by Daniel Bell called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. I've made Dr. Bell's argument bigger. That's all I've done. And this is just a phenomenological dialectic. Excuse my language at work. In simpler language, all it means is that anything fine, if it is taken too far and left unbalanced by moderation and common sense, will eventually undermine its own premises and conditions of success. And this is exactly what I think Americans have let happen to liberal democracy. Now, to this construction, I then add a chapter on neuroscience, which is a little unusual for this sort of stuff, but it turns out, in my view, that it's absolutely necessary to show how the digital tsunami, as some people call it, is changing our brain circuitry, just as the epigenetic advent of literacy did some millennia ago. The shift from a written back to an oral culture has massive implications for liberal democratic attitudes, norms, and functionality. Oral, and especially image-heavy, screen-born, so two-dimensional sensory input is long on present orientation and emotion. It is also great for communicating simple zero-sum plots like the kind we see in fictive scripts in mass entertainment, TV, and movies. The roughly 48 to 50% of adult Americans, that's a large number, who carry credit card debt from month to month. 48 to 50%. And the average debt is more than $6,000 US. And they carry the debt, half the adult population, right? Those people align pretty closely with those who do not deep read and who marinate a lot, and I mean a whole lot, in screen-born fictive fare. The result is that many Americans now cannot imagine an accounting of any real-world phenomenon that is more complex than a dumbed-down TV or movie script. They see the world as if it were a reality TV show, and often enough, they see themselves as if they were in a reality TV set. Human beings are mimetic creatures. Imbibe enough of this stuff, and knowingly or not, people begin to absorb and affect not merely the expressions and the emotional aura of the fare, but also its logical structure, its logical syntax, so to speak. And what's that like? What is that? What is that about? It's very much like the mythic consciousness that preceded literacy, and it, like its predecessor, is organized by two laws, the law of consanguinity and the law of metamorphosis. And here I'm taking directly from Ernst Cassirer, for those of you who have heard of him. The Metamorphosis, by the way, is the title that Ovid gave to his 15-volume compilation of the Greek myths. And it wasn't by accident that he called it Metamorphosis. If you know the Greek myths, you'll understand right away why. You know what happens in those myths. So the law of consanguinity is all about how it feels. This consciousness is about a unity of feeling and sensation. It's not about what is. It's not about facts. There are no facts. And if you hear the footsteps of postmodernism in the background, that there are no facts, then you've got very good ears. Because in this respect, postmodernism sounds an awful lot like pre-modernism. But in any event, metamorphosis, it means anything can become anything else and can become it back again. And there is no timelines. There's no before and after. There's no concrete sense of the future, just like there's no concrete sense of the past. In the Greek myths, people go back and forth. There is no before and after. And that's what this mentality is like. And more important, actually, um, this mentality is kind of schizoid. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, it is intensely concrete. If something isn't real, if you can't feel it, uh, it's not there. But it's also imaginatively otherworldly on the other hand, in the sense of childlike and dreamlike. So this answers the question that so many Americans have lately expressed puzzlement about. How could so many voters prioritize the price of eggs over the authoritarian threat to democracy, civility, and truth that Donald Trump so clearly posed? And the answer is very simple. To a lot of people, evidently 49.78% of the electorate, the price of eggs is a number, and both are very concrete. But authoritarianism, as well as democracy, civility, and truth, are abstractions. And non readers whose mentality has regressed to a pre literate mode are not very good with understanding or deploying abstractions. Conspiracy theories, yes, they well fit the mold of childlike and dreamlike imaginative play. But pure abstractions, not so much. So here's the rub. To get right down to the nub of it, classical 18th, 19th century liberalism, classical liberalism, is based on a jointure of the Scottish Enlightenment and the pro-modernist Anglican Lutheran chart of the Protestant Reformation. It cannot survive the new orality, cannot survive regression back to the mythical consciousness. It cannot survive the occlusion of rational causality against irreverent magical efficacy. And we see magical efficacy all over the place today on the extreme left as well as the extreme right. It is quite remarkable. If you know how to look for it, you can find it. Classical liberalism and liberalism joined to democracy needs scripture. It needs writing and it needs reading. And the best example, of course, is the law itself. The rule of law. Law must be written down and it must be read. If it isn't, you have again the rule of men, not the rule of law, or at the best, rule by, but not rule of law. Not the same thing. Wherever law ends, tyranny begins. Who said that? John Locke said that, and he was correct. And again, as I mentioned, thanks to the July 1st SCOTUS decision on presidential immunity, made up out of partisan whole cloth, as best as I can tell, though I'm not a lawyer, we are well on the way to enshrining a president who doesn't just think that he's above the law, but for most practical purposes now actually is above the law. And so almost by definition then, by default, is a tyrant. The new orality, like the old orality, is sharply disposed to zero-sum thinking. And I want to emphasize this and then stop and get on to the international implications. I know time is passing. It's hard to overstate the implications of the regression to the zero-sum mentality for American politics. America, as both an idea and a polity, was born in the womb of the Scottish Enlightenment. And the single most important thing about the Enlightenment that ever pierced the minds of common citizens is that the relationships between and among both individuals and groups need not be zero-sum. Win-win, positive-sum outcomes can be constructed by the use of reason carefully applied to institutional design. And the metaphor that the United States, that America uses, is that of the dynamic equilibrium. I mean, you have checks and balances. You have the invisible hand. You have e pluribus unum. Everything about the United States is about balance and about the possibility of positive sum relationships and about procedure to adjudicate conflict rather than winners and losers only, knaves and fools, as Jonathan Smith put it in Two Men in a Tub. This is the genius of the Enlightenment, all right, to break the back of the zero sum, the law of the jungle kind of way of thinking about human relations. And it's quite remarkable, if you look at modern understanding, anthropology, primatology, whatever, the reason that human beings have become so successful at managing our environment is because we learn how to cooperate. Our brains are large enough that we can cooperate. So the idea that human relations are built only on conflict, competition and conflict, and never on cooperation despite what is before our eyes when we look at families, when we look at extended families, when we look at tribes, when we look at communities, right? And we use language and we use reading and writing to expand the zone of possible cooperation. That's what makes us human. We are a tri-generational species, according to the late David Goodman. That's why we are what we are, because we have learned to cooperate. So for ideologues to come both on left and right and say that it's only conflict that matters, only conflict, is to me just bizarre. And I've never really been able to understand how anybody could think such a thing like that. But obviously people do, and it's not just on the Randian right, it's also on the woke left. It's what identity politics is about. It's what critical race theory is about. This zero sum only conflict way of looking at life. And the problem is, I'm a great believer in phenomenology, and my old mentor Irving Goffman once said, "Social life takes up and freezes into it the conceptions that we have of it." Uh, to in plain English, it means that if we believe something is so, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if we believe something is not so, it won't. So if enough people believe that life is nasty, brutish, and short, right, and must be so, to quote Hobbes, if people believe it's the law of the jungle, it's the survival of the fittest, it's only winners and losers, it's dog. Have you ever seen a dog eat another dog? I never have. Dog eat dog. Then we will comport ourselves and act in such a ways to bring that reality into being. But it's not necessary. It's not in concrete. It's not the way that it isn't really human nature. We are a self-completing autogenic animal as a species. We can create any future we want if you want it hard enough. The idea that somehow this is in the stars, that this is how human beings are, crooked and fallen. I don't believe that, and I hope none of you do, because it's not true. And history proves that when people get together and they cooperate, they can create a better life for everybody. Everybody in the tribe, and then everybody, the neighbors down the river. So what is really remarkable to me, as I said, is that both the Randian right, of which Donald Trump is a poster child, and the woke left, right, they basically believe the same, they basically hold the same premise about human nature. And it's wrong. And this is very disturbing, but what are you going to do? In order to argue this back from the center, from the liberal center, from the positive sum center, from the Enlightenment center, you need to sit people down and you need to talk to them seriously. You need to have some patience, and they need to have some patience. You need to put it in writing. You need to read. You need to study, right? It doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. But that's not the cultural meme right now in the United States, where everything is entertainment, everything is spectacular, everything is trying to be in the now, wow, in the attention economy, trying to get people to actually sit and think about these things. And we don't teach civics anymore in the United States very well. Trying to get people to sit down and think about, I mean, you might as well, try to teach a coconut algebra. It's very difficult, not impossible. Some coconuts have learned algebra, I guess. It's very hard, however, to get these kinds of sedate, non-emotional, rational messages across to people. It's getting harder and harder to do that. Now, I'm not going to go through the contrast between. I could talk for a little while about how the differences between zero-sum thinking and positive-sum thinking affect almost everything in political culture. They affect how we think of leadership. They affect how we think of time. They affect how we think of history, whether it's a nightmare or whether it's a stepping stone to possible progress, if we know how to do that. It affects almost everything about our political culture. And the point right now is that the return of the zero sum is almost everywhere we look in the United States, everywhere we look in American culture. And I've written about the sources of it. But it is corrosive, deeply, deeply corrosive of liberal principles and democratic order. And what we see now with Donald Trump winning the election on November 5th, and he's not the cause of this. He's a symptom of a change in the culture that has been going on now for decades. He is, however, having been elected first and now having been elected again, he is a ratifier and an accelerant of these trends. And I don't frankly know if there is any way back from where we have come. Now, what does all this have to do with foreign policy and international security policy? Trump is, on all points, whole of government insurgent in his own mind. If you know what whole of government means, that was supposed to be amusing, but if you don't, that's okay. His zero-sum Randian worldview is revealed through his view on domestic political life, but it extends as well to his view, I wouldn't call it thoughts, but his views to foreign policy. In truth, Trump doesn't really have actual ideas, as best I can tell. He has an accumulation of irritable gestures masquerading as ideas. he's really well described, very well described by Jose Ortega y Gasset in his classic book, The Revolt of the Masses, written in Spanish in 1929. Um, let me just quote Ortega y Gasset and see if he rings any bells to you if you've been observing Donald Trump and the MAGA types over these years. The not particularly well educated modern man, modern mass man, quote, wishes to have opinions, but is unwilling to accept the conditions and presuppositions that underlie all opinion. To have an idea means believing one is in possession of the reasons for having it, and consequently means believing that there is such a thing as reason, a world of intelligible truths. To have ideas, to form opinions, is identical with appealing to such an authority, and therefore believing that the highest form of intercommunion is the dialogue in which the reasons for our ideas are discussed. But the mass man would feel himself lost if he accepted discussion, and instinctively repudiates the obligation of accepting that supreme authority lying outside himself. Close quote. This, Ortega y Gasset continued, gave rise to both the left wing and right wing extremists of his day. Quote, the fascists and the syndicalist species, characterized by a type of man who did not care to give reasons or even to be right, but who was simply resolved to impose his opinions. That was the novelty, the right not to be right, not to be reasonable, the reason of unreason. Close quote. Now, if you don't recognize the MAGA insistence on its surrealist alternative truths, its conspiratorial deep state mania, its fairy tale depth logic in Ortega y Gasset's description, then you might frankly be beyond help. But I think that most of you, in fact, can recognize it. Now, how can we understand the connective tissue? Last part, Adrian, don't get excited. Don't get too excited. The last part, how can we understand the connective tissue between America's Enlightenment, born domestic political culture, and its foreign policy? Well, this is actually pretty simple. American leaders on balance have been inheritors, keepers, and innovators within a political culture unique to history, the Enlightenment-based precepts of classical liberal democracy. Again, the result of a rare occurrence of historical trends, the budding age of reason entwined with the progressive and still energetic modernist shard of the Protestant Reformation. And all of this in the context, by the way, of the post-Gutenberg explosion of mass literacy and education really did give rise to something new under the sun. The revolutionary idea of popular sovereignty, joined to Republican principles of equal dignity, opportunity, and standing before the law. And by the way, equal standing before the law was not important because all people were deemed to be equal. Quite the reverse. Equal standard before the law and equal dignity was necessary precisely because people were not equal. I hope that's understandable to people. It used to be very, very clear to most people. It's not so clear anymore that I can tell. So in large part because the DNA of American democracy resides in Protestantism, it was inevitable that thought about the historical arc of the American experience would mimic Christian eschatological themes. And thus the universalism inherent to Protestantism, as to Christianity generally, led to an expectation among the more pious idealists of the American Revolution that an American empire of liberty, to quote Jefferson's phrase, would one day become universal best practice. In other words, evangelical American thinking about politics and norms. That evangelical messianic Christological tinge to American principles of civic order is very, very clear in American foreign policy thinking. And they extrude most frequently whenever military action is deemed necessary. I've got a couple of examples here in case you don't know them, because most of you are not Americans. Not for no reason, for example, did Julia Ward Howe write into the lyrics of the Battle Hymn of the Republic the following words: "As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free." Close quote. How does that sit with you? Not for no reason either did General Eisenhower, before his Eve of D-Day address, called the forthcoming battle a crusade. And not for no reason either did President George W. Bush use the same word in his first major speech after September 11th, 2001, as it turned out, without having any idea of the etymology of the word. So it goes. Now, a few people are aware of this religious connection, and they affirm it. but most are influenced by it without being able to name it. It kind of it's like the water to the goldfish. It's just there all the time. Um, some people have been unhappy about the Christian universalism that sources the supposed universal applicability of Western values. And here's how the most creative political scientists of the 20th century put it, quote, individual liberty, political democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and cultural freedom make Western civilization unique. And Western civilization is valuable not because it is universal, but because it is unique. Now, some evidence for Samuel Huntington's observation, that's Sam Huntington, who I was honored to have on both editorial boards of the magazines that I edited, have tended to see liberal democracy as not just something that works well, but something civic that is nevertheless associated with the sacred. And that is because the origins of the liberalism story and the democracy story too are interwoven with religion, particularly Protestantism. Asian democracy obviously exists, but its appeal is far more pragmatic, at least as I've been able to determine. Liberal democracy's value hierarchy doesn't resonate so well, not the same way, with the major Asian faith communities. It does not echo back a deeper sense of the sacred, of a civil religion, as some have called it, as is the case for Americans. So it's very ironic if you think about it. A particularist, if Huntington is right, and I believe he's perfectly right, a particularist political culture generating a universalism presumed mistakenly to be the source of its own thinking. As ironies go, that one's pretty hard to beat, it seems to me. I'd like to repeat that, but I don't have time. Ironic or not, you can't explain the twists and turns of U.S. foreign policy any other way. As many have observed, the U.S. provision of common global security goods since 1945, 1947, somewhere in there, the so-called rules-based international liberal order, is just an extension, a projection of the Enlightenment-born positive sum concepts of American domestic political and also socioeconomic institutions. And contrary to adversary culture accusations over the years that really it's all capitalist-based, it's the Leninist theory of imperialism, it's actually just not true. From my experience in the government, what we've been trying to do all these years has we've been trying to do well by doing good. Good is defined as building an international community on the model of U.S. liberal democratic domestic community. For that quasi-messianic ideologized security concerns always took place, especially during the Cold War, over economic interests in almost every case in which they clashed. American power was so great after World War II, and for many years after World War II, that the world's normative Overton window, I hope everyone knows what that means, really did move in that direction. Power has a way of making its point, doesn't it? At least to some extent. But the assumption of global universality was wrong, just as Christianity's assumption of universal right and true religion, in my opinion, has been wrong. In both cases, theology trying and failing to trump a capaciously diverse global cultural landscape. So when the preponderance of U.S. power gradually diminished as other powers revived and new powers arose, the goal, the dream really, of a world looking ever more like a cooperative civic order, instead of looking like a Hobbesian realist war of all against all pre-Enlightenment disorder, that dream began to look like a chimera. And ironically, very ironically, I think, the West's victory in the Cold War accelerated the dimming of the dream. Georgy Arbatov once said to me in Moscow in 1990, I think it was, that if the West won the Cold War, the United States would suffer enemy deprivation. He was not wrong, but he missed the point. The West's victory diminished both its unity and its ideological verve. And so in the United States, undermined support at home for taking risks and making sacrifices to provide global security goods. We still did this, but the support for it and our heart, the support for it dimmed, and our heart wasn't in it the same way. It was still true that not doing this would likely give rise in due course to a far more dangerous world, such that the US government would have to spend a whole lot more to get a lot less security. But this was an argument that the American public gradually over time either didn't understand or didn't credit. And it happened to be an argument that in the critical 8-year period of the Clinton administration, following directly on the disintegration of the Soviet Union, with only the interregnum of the first Gulf War in between, was not made very well. Instead of rethinking the relationship between America's Cold War posture and commitments on the one hand, and the new situation of Borning on the other, Clinton administration principles instead hailed the utopian-esque convergence of American power and principle, declared the end of history, and took an extended holiday from geopolitical reality. And since the end of the Clinton administration, the rationale for maintaining, with adjustments, the basic structure of the post-war era, with the alliances and institutions built to work it, has grown ever more vague, ever more qualified, and ever more weak. This was and is natural. The reason we built the thing in the first place more or less disappeared between in 1989 and 1992, and we were not very creative about how to evolve the so-called liberal international order so that it asked less of the United States and so aligned better with a distracted public opinion. It's been a gradual thing, the instinct being to change less rather than more on account of the uncertainty of what change would produce until now. And now the change has come very, very fast. With Trump's election in November of last year, it's clear that the nadir of Enlightenment attitudes in American domestic culture has been a harbinger to the end of the projection of those attitudes into American foreign and national security policy. As the assumption of exceptionalism no longer exists in domestic policy, in either party, except really in highly selected forms here and there, and Obama, by the way, was ahead of Trump in dissing American exceptionalism. Some of you may remember. So Pax Americana, to the extent that it ever existed, exists no more. As of January 20th, it exists no more. The shell may still be there. I mean, these alliances will exist in name. The NATO alliance, the hub and spoke alliances the United States has in the Middle East and in Asia, they'll still exist. But who's going to believe them? Who's going to trust them, given the America first and only Randian mentality of the commander in chief? You already see people hedging their bets about what the future holds, and well, they should. So, are we back now to a take no prisoners realism? Back to the rape of Milos? Back, as Thucydides described in the Melian dialogues, back to an international life nasty, brutish, and short, especially for small, weak countries? Is that where we are? You'd like to think that when Thucydides wrote the famous line, "The strong do what they can while the weak suffer what they must," that he must have done it in sorrow. But contemporary zero-sum proponents like Donald Trump utter it with aplomb as a preemptive excuse for their own contemplated program of exclusionary self-advancement on the individual scale and on the national scale. Now, in mid-January, just a couple days ago, as you all know, I think, President-elect stirred outrage in many quarters by blustering about Greenland and Panama, Canada. Worked great as a distraction while he was trying to subordinate the legal system, but it didn't qualify as even a comic book quality material compared to what is very likely to come. Can you imagine if the United States used force to invade Greenland and the other NATO allies invoked Article 5 of the NATO Treaty? Do you know what that would mean? That would mean we would be at war with ourselves. I mean, that's almost funny. So it's not likely to happen, I hope. Who seriously, given the way that Donald Trump thinks about the world, the zero sum, who can imagine Donald Trump championing with any kind of energy aid to victims of natural disasters, tsunamis, earthquakes, landslides in the future? I mean, he even punched out on California a couple of days ago, despite its wildfires. When he asked what was in it for those dead U.S. soldiers buried in France and so on. Can you imagine a person like that wanting to participate vigorously in any global commons project, whether environmental or concerning human rights issues like trafficking in persons? All that sort of cooperation on behalf of a larger human community is the last thing from Trump's Randian zero-sum mind. Now, Sam Huntington, were he still with us, he would be dismayed at this. He would be dismayed. He didn't like the promoting democracy idealism, the sort of evangelical, like the ladies in the church basement in Toledo sending out the missionaries. He didn't like that kind of stuff at all, right? His insistence on Western particularism, to the extent of his reputation and influence, worked to limit excessive foreign policy idealism, which has gotten the United States in trouble many times. But Sam never meant for that idealism to immolate itself in a soup of Randian sewage. Whatever the source or historical soundness of American idealism, high morale does count for something in a going civilizational concern. So the universal bowsprit of American exceptionalism, as it has come to be understood, bore benefits as well as the dangers that Sam understood. not least as a bulwark against the kind of erosive pessimism currently stalking the United States. Indeed, optimism is quintessentially American, or it used to be. At our best, the pioneering spirit rhymes well with modernity's face pointed toward the future. So whether Western ways are potentially universal or not, the West was unique in having achieved what may be described as the conquest of political Malthusianism. We were the masters of our own fate. We were the captains of our own ship. We really could change things, right? And that extended beyond domestic politics, of course, to US power to inhabit and to change international politics. Now, think about it. When Americans decided finally to point their exceptionalism outward into the world after World War II, instead of inward as before, we did it explicitly to remake the world's political order after our image of it here at home, to make international anarchy into a kind of civil society as far as we could. You even see it in the design of the FDR administrations of the United Nations. Now, think about this. Who's the Secretary General? He's the President. What's the Security Council? It's the Senate. What's the General Assembly? It's the House of Representatives. What's the Supreme Court? It's the International Court of Justice. What's the World Health Organization? It's Health and Human Services plus the CD. You get the idea, you get the point? It was modeled directly on American institutions. All this was, of course, based deep down on something called the democratic peace theory. The idea that democratic countries do not go to war with each other. Hark the angels sing, it would be if everybody would read from the same democratic hymnal. But the United States no longer cares particularly much about democracy, at least not these guys who are about to take office in a couple of days. And what happens, therefore, to democratic peace theory and to the motive to nurture international community again, insofar as that's possible? Well, it pretty much vanishes. It's pretty much gone away. If you don't believe in the hymnal anymore for domestic purposes, you sure ain't going to be enthusiastic about sending the missionaries out to convert the heathens and teach them how to act civilized like us, you know? And that, folks, is where we are right now. For good or not for good, that is where we are. In the Trump insurgency's foreign policy aspect, every cooperative aspect of post-war experience, our post-war experience will be devalued. And the principle of genuine alliances, as opposed to temporary transactional relationships, will most especially be devalued. Everything is transactional to Donald Trump. Everything in his mind almost everything is about money. Everyone would punch down as he does whenever he has the chance. That's just the way of the world in his view. And it's soft-headed nonsense to think otherwise. This is New York City stuff. This is the Mafia Don way of seeing the world, which Trump learned from the movies and TV, and maybe from other sources of family distress in his own young life. But now listen to this. Listen to this. I'm going to start with the word blank, and by blank I mean a name. All right. You have to figure. Your job is to figure out who's speaking and who's being spoken of. Here it goes. Blank sought to obliterate all references to eternal justice, the equality of man, the rights of individuals or nations, the liberty of conscience, the fight for civilization, and other phrases that were the stock and trade of the democratic movements of his time. He looked upon these as so much worthless cant. Who's the writer and who's the subject, right? I wish we were in a room together. This would be we could have so much fun. The writer was none other than Sir Isaiah Berlin, writing a biography in 1939 of who? Who was he writing a biography of? Does anybody know? Yes, that's right. That is right. Karl Marx. Now, wait a minute. I hear some of you say, I can hear some of you say, Marx? Sounds like Trump. Sounds like Marx? Sounds like Trump. Well, yikes, it's the same thing. Yes, it is. It's zero sum. It's conflict only. It's law of the jungle. It's survival of the fittest. The same damn thing. That is not Enlightenment thinking. That is not American thinking until now. Again, both on the left and on the illiberal left and on the illiberal right. And what's happening is that the noise that the extremes have been making with the help of the clickbait media in the United States has taken the oxygen out of the center. So all of the defenders of positive sum relationships and cooperation and liberalism, all the things that we grew up with thinking was just normal matter-of-fact ways that good human beings behave, you can't get a word in edgewise hardly anymore. You looked at like a sap doing that. If you go to my manuscript, The Age of Spectacle, I've got lots of examples of people actually, kind of kind of saying to themselves, why should I as a politician, why should I as a lawyer, why should I as anybody, why should I struggle to keep my head above the ethical waterline, right? When all of these important people, all of these powerful people, are just treating the world like it's, like it's a nasty, brutish, and short, like zero. Why am I putting myself out for this? And so pretty soon, a lot of people are starting to think, well, I'm not gonna anymore. This was all a bunch of eyewash. I've been deluded all my life into thinking that these high sounding things mattered. Now I'm not gonna. Now I'm just gonna do what everybody else does. So there's a civilizational problem here as well as a political and a foreign policy problem. The whole ethos of the culture has been undermined by what has been going on, and it has been capped, and it has been what's the word I want, megaphoned by what happened on November 5th. People are really down in the dumps here about this. People who thought this kind of thing could never happen, and then it happened. Right now, what's going to happen in the world as a result of all this? Well, I've already said people are already hedging bets. If the Americans aren't going, if the cavalry's not going to come to your rescue, it's back to self-help. And so, what self-help does, self-help always generates security dilemmas. What one country thinks it's doing to defend itself, some neighbor might think it is offensively intended. And so they then have to defend themselves about what they think might be offensively intended. And so you know how this works. This is classical stuff, right? This is the security dilemma. That's what's going to be happening. And in foreign affairs recently, even in foreign affairs, no less, two experts on Korea are advising South Korea to get nuclear weapons in order to deter North Korea, because the American nuclear umbrella is no longer credible for the next 4 years in the Trump administration. What are the Taiwanese going to do? A guy who used to be a speechwriter for Bill Clinton some years ago, a guy named Jeff Frankel, wrote a very clever article a couple of days ago in which he's pretending now that it's December 31st, 2025. And he's looking back on the year and he's telling you what happened. So in his estimation, looking back from all the way to the end of the year, what 2025 is going to bring, Venezuela is going to invade Guyana, and Ethiopia is going to invade Somalia, and Indonesia is going to invade Timor-Leste, and the Iranians are going to go hell bent for a nuclear breakout. What's going to happen then, I don't know. And we're likely to have, because of tariffs and other curtailments of international trade, an international credit crunch, and we're likely to have high inflation, and we're likely to have low growth rates because of supply chain and energy disorientation. The dollar is going to be harmed by all this. It may not remain the international currency. People who love cryptocurrency are looking forward to that, including Elon Musk. I think that's great, but it's not good for everybody else if the dollar is no longer the international currency, and so on and so forth, predicting all these horrible things. And about China, well, China continues to militarize all the islands in the South China Sea, and with the United States doesn't like this, but it doesn't come to anything until there's a collision at sea between the Chinese Navy and the American Navy, in which some U.S. soldiers are killed. And Trump, of course, just like reacts to people thinking that he's a weakling. You know how he feels about that kind of thing. So he joins with the Philippines, and there's a military expedition to retake Scarborough Shoal and the Spratly Islands. And as a result of that, according to Jeff Frankel, and according to that, then what the Chinese do next is they quarantine throw a naval quarantine around Taiwan. Trump gets mad and he orders the entire U.S. Navy to break the quarantine, but the U.S. Navy hasn't actually done close combat for decades. It's all been naval air standoff kinds of missions, and it doesn't really know how to fight, and it doesn't go very well. And Trump gets angry and he threatens to escalate, and then the year ends on the cusp of a major war. But because the year ends, Jeff Frankel doesn't feel like he has to say what actually is going to happen next. But that's the kind of speculation. It's basically the cat's away, the mice will play. There's no policeman, there's no fire brigade to put out the fires. So the strong will do whatever they want, and the weak will have to suffer whatever they must. And that's the anticipation of a lot of places around the world. I don't know if this is right. I think predictions like this are kind of a mug's game with an unpredictable character like Donald Trump. And I think in circumstances like that, I think a lot of people are going to be extra cautious simply because they realize what, the dangers of a mousetrap kind of destabilization. I don't know. But it's not going to be like the security environment is not going to be like the way it's been, the way people have grown used to it over decades. It's going to change, I think, fairly dramatically and fairly quickly. A lot of people don't believe me, when I the year I spent in Singapore, I tried to tell people that this kind of thing was advancing, and a lot of people either they didn't believe me or they didn't want to seem like they believed me. Um, you know, that's okay. But John Kenneth Galbraith wrote a book on the great crash, stock market crash of October 2000, 1929, and he had a great line in it. He wrote in it, "The end had come, but it was not yet in sight." When things like this happen, they tend to happen really fast, and people just can't figure out what hit them. Right? Um, it's like it's slow, it's slow, it's slow. It's like a frog in a pot. You don't notice it, and then all of a sudden there's a state change, and you go, "What the hell just happened?" And I think a lot of people over the next 3 or 4 months are going to have that kind of reaction. They're going to look around and they're going to see some strange things they didn't expect, and they're going to say, "What the hell is happening here?" And I think I've tried to give you some idea of what the hell is happening here. So I'll stop there, Adrian. Let me check the time.
Thank you, Adam. Right, so we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So what I'll do is try to summarize some of the questions that we had. Really, our audience is really interested in what do you think the US is going to do specifically, really, in Southeast Asia? I know you mentioned, right, Chinese actions in the South China Sea, but what do you think, the Trump administration will do or focus on in Southeast Asia, and how do you think Southeast Asian countries will react to Trump 2.0?
Well, Southeast Asia is never been my academic specialty, and having spent 1 year in Singapore doesn't make me an expert in the region. I would know more about the region if I'd been able to go to the countries that invited me, but COVID made that impossible, which I regret deeply. I don't think Southeast Asia as such is actually on Donald Trump's mind. China is, all right, but I think all the countries around China are kind of vague in Trump's head. Um, I think a lot of people realize that back in the first term, once he was shown a map of East Asia, and he mistook North Korea for part of the ocean because it was a nighttime photograph from one of our satellites, and there's not a lot of electricity. So he doesn't even know the basic map geography of Asia. Um, I think what Trump is really concerned about, insofar as he has a geopolitical instinct, it's about the New World. It's about the United States. It's about South America, Central America, the Caribbean, Mexico in particular, and that's why Marco Rubio is a good fit for Trump's head, because that's all that Marco Rubio knows or cares about. I think pretty much in Trump's head, the rest of the world can go hang. He's really interested in reinforcing his domestic political power and suborning any enemy that he can think of who might prevent him from basically doing whatever the hell he wants. So he'll be reactive to anything that happens in Southeast Asia, and whoever becomes assistant secretary for Asia, and whoever becomes the DoD officers who are responsible, the military people, PACCOM, those guys, they're going to keep an eye on what's going on like they have been all along. But they're going to get some mixed signals or no signals from the top. It's also going to be very interesting to see what kind of ambassadors the administration appoints to Indonesia, to Thailand, to Malaysia, Singapore, and elsewhere. They're probably going to be more than usual political appointees who have given money to the MAGA world, but who don't necessarily know anything except the money side about these places. And again, Trump really cares mostly about money. In a way, it's okay, because I think the Chinese, for the most part, still care a lot about, not only about, but mostly about money. And as long as there's no rogue thing that happens, I could imagine 4 years going by, like 4 years went by between 2017 and 2021, nothing really horrible happened. All right. On the other hand, like in Jeff Frankel's scenario, where he says, well, Trump feels as though his image, his manliness has been damaged and threatened by a Chinese action. He could react in a very strange, unpredictable, and irresponsible way. And this wouldn't be the first time. The United States has has a reputation. Remember, you don't remember because you weren't born. I was 2 years old. I remember it well. No, I wasn't born either. Press conference, Dean Acheson put South Korea outside the U.S. defense perimeter. And so, of course, people in Moscow and in Pyongyang got the idea, well, we could just march right into South Korea and the Americans won't do anything about it. So they march into South Korea, and what do? We go to war. We have done that before. We react to things without giving anybody any real evidence that we will. And I think a personality like Trump is very capable of completely unpredictable rogue actions that could work out fine for the United States or could be catastrophic for everybody. I've worried for a long time for reasons I won't go into right now because they're a little complex. I've worried about over militarizing and overburdening the so-called China threat in the United States. I don't think that there ever needs to be a war between China and the United States. I think sensible people with some diplomatic skills can work out pretty much any problem that arises. I have a lot more concern about in the future, ultimately anyway, a war that might break out between China and India for reasons I won't go into. But a U.S.-Chinese war, if that happens, it'll be totally unnecessary and unbelievably stupid. And the metaphor you hear a lot, right? Well, it's rising power, Wilhelmine Germany, right? And inevitably rising power. That's a bunch of baloney, right? That's a kind of determinism that to me is a surrender to foolishness and to a kind of a mechanistic way of thinking about history. That's not true at all. Let me just go on a little bit. The United States, at least before the Trump administration, our exceptionalism is an outward pointed exceptionalism. Americans have typically thought about themselves, again, until recently, we are wonderful. We are the savior of the globe. Everybody can be like us. So why don't you be like us? And everybody can be a democracy, and then we'll have peace and prosperity, and everybody will be fine, okay? The Chinese sense of exceptionalism, Chinese have a sense of exceptionalism, but it's the opposite of the United States. It's that we're great, we're the Middle Kingdom, and nobody can be like us, right? So the idea that somehow there's a new Cold War, I mean, I won't mention any names, but a new Cold War, I mean, this is bollocks to me. The Cold War with a capital C and a capital W, right? The Cold War was defined by three basic qualities. One, it was a seriously ideological competition. It had to do with each side's idea of what the moral paternity of the world would be. The Soviets had an ideology that was potentially avowedly universally applicable to all peoples, universalism. I can't find in China, in any kind of China, in any Chinese, in anything, an aspiration to remake the whole world ideologically in the image of Han Chinese. It's an ethno-nationalist kind of it's an ethno-nationalist kind of thing, right? Secondly, the Cold War was fought among blocs. There was the major power, but then there were blocs. And that allowed a certain flexibility and fungibility to the competition. You could fight proxy wars. You could gain or lose a client, right? In the case of the US-China relationship, what's the Chinese bloc? Cambodia? There's no bloc, right? And thirdly, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was basically, except toward the very end of the period, was autarkic, right? It didn't want a lot of exchange, cultural and economic exchange with the rest of the world. China is just the reverse. It's hardly autarkic. It has more of its GNP involved in trade than any other country in the world right now. Any other major country. So to call the U.S. Chinese, I'll call it a rivalry, right? To call the rivalry a new Cold War, to me, is to first of all mislead people as to what the original Cold War actually was, and it is to hype the danger of the situation that we're in. I think it's just, as I said, it's bollocks. But it worries me because people could talk themselves into great, very stupid things. So again, I'll repeat, I don't think, Trump with the tariffs, he might raise tariffs. He wants to solidify union support. He wants to make sure the Democrats never get back the working class and the union people. He may do it for that reason, but it's all about money. And it's all about, it's what he thinks. He's a concrete thinker, right? uh, he doesn't have a strategic view of Chinese American geopolitical competition, maritime. He doesn't think that way. Now, maybe his national security advisor or some other advisors will think that, but this president doesn't think that way. All right. So I really can't answer your question. Um, I just don't think, I don't think Southeast Asia is really on his radar right now. And unless something happens to put it there, it'll stay off his radar. And it'll be second and third echelon people and the ambassadors who'll be managing those relationships.
Thanks, Adam. I think we have one more question, and this question will be about domestic politics, right? So you just talked about Trump wanting to win and solidify the working class vote with tariffs, and we saw with the results of the November election is that he has surprisingly built a relatively large GOP tent, right? But part of forming this larger GOP tent, this GOP coalition, is that we are now seeing tensions within the coalition, right? So we have right tensions between Bannon and Musk. So I was wondering, what do you make, especially of this relationship between
Yeah.
Trump and Musk, and how long do you think right this will last and its implications for the GOP coalition?
That's an excellent question, and everyone's been thinking about this. When I think about this, I mean, this may sound odd to some people, but I go right back to Plato. I go back to the Republic, Book 8. Okay, in Plato's way of thinking about the movement of one kind of regime to another, all right, he moves from philosopher kings to oligarchies to democracies which then corrode themselves and turn into tyranny, and so on and so forth. Right? We all know. Anybody who knows the classics at all knows Plato. I mean, people say that all political theory is a footnote to Plato. It's not half wrong. So but here's the thing: in Plato's system of thinking, what is going on right now? You have a country, the United States, that claims to be a democracy, that is simultaneously leading into an oligarchy and a tyranny. Musk and Thiel and David Sachs and all of those people, right? First of all, none of those three people were born in the United States. Musk and Sachs were born in South Africa. Thiel was born in Frankfurt, Germany. What are they doing in the United States? Right? The United States is the biggest market. It's the most vibrant technological center in the world. It also has the lowest of all the advanced Western countries. It has the lowest regulation, lowest taxation, and no prospect of doing much more than that. So they are, in Mansur Olson's language, of those who know the literature, they are right now acting as stationary bandits. If they feel that they're going to be squeezed out of the MAGA tent, they're going to become roving bandits, in Mansur Olson's language. But right now, they're pretty confident that they can stay and be stationary bandits. And Bannon put it perfectly the other day in an interview with Corriere della Sera in Italy. He said these people are techno-feudalists, and he's got it. I don't like Steve Bannon very much, but when he's right, he's right. That's exactly what they are, right? If anybody out there has ever read Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, science fiction, but the basic setting, not the story, but the setting to Diamond Age envisages a world in which there are no governments, in which corporations essentially rule everything through nanotech surveillance, telepathy, and people are divided into what he calls philes, P-H-Y-L-E-S, affinity groups that are not geographically contiguous, but that are a distributed system and can be anywhere on the planet. Okay, to me, so people like Thiel and Elon Musk, they are following the footsteps of a book written, published in 1995 called The Sovereign Individual. I don't know if people have heard of that book. One of the authors is a member of the House of Lords in Britain. The other is an American guy who helped him write it. This book was written, in the throes of the end of the Cold War, and it was basically how to get rich in an anarchical international financial environment and not give a crap about anybody else. All right. And if you read that book and then you look at what Musk and what these guys do, I swear to God, it's like they read this book and they memorized it because that's what they're doing. Now, here's the thing. the techno-feudalists want to diminish the power of the state. They want to void. They don't. That's why the House Republicans recently basically destroyed the IRS prospective budget after having built the IRS back up from COVID to the point where they can actually do their job. Republicans basically cut it off at the knees. Why? Because they don't want these people snooping into white collar crime. It's basically what it comes down to. Right? You know how much uncollected money, uncollected taxes there are? It's like $640 billion. If that money could be collected, then poor people in the United States might have the breaks and the services they actually need. But Musk doesn't care. He doesn't care about anybody except himself and keeping Trump on his right side. But Trump, what does Trump want to do? Trump wants to weaponize the federal government, right, to go after his enemies. Raj Patel, Pam Bondi, good Lord. He wants to go after his enemies. He is vindictive, and he means it, right? Now, that aggrandizes state power. How can you have an administration that on the one hand wants to diminish the power of the federal government and on the other hand wants to aggrandize it? This to me is an unresolvable tension. But then I said, wait a minute. These things cover different areas of the federal government. Could they coexist? Well, Bannon said in the interview that he thinks Musk is evil. He's going to kick him out of the White House. He's not going to have a blue card. He's not going to be able to. I don't know why Bannon thinks he's going to be, Prince in waiting to Donald Trump. We'll see, right? But this is all about the H1, the visas, right? Which is essentially an indentured servitude form of exploitation. You know that about 65 or 70% of the engineers in Silicon Valley are foreign born. It's just because we can't teach STEM stuff right in the United States anyway. It's really outrageous. This is a huge tension. That's not the only one. But this is a serious. Take J.D. Vance, who will be our new vice president. J.D. Vance, as a junior senator from Ohio, right, got a 0% rating from organized labor. 0%. He didn't vote right even once. And yet, organized labor in Ohio and elsewhere, by and large, voted for Trump. Now, I blame this on the Democrats. I blame this on their utter stupidity over I don't know how many years now of abandoning the working class for the culture wars and acting like a bunch of pinheads. And I've written about this, and I can explain more about why I think the election turned out the way that it was. But it really, in a sense, was the Democrats' election to lose. But what did they? But look at the candidate. I mean, Trump has beaten two very weak female candidates. That didn't have to happen. If this party had a brain for how to actually do politics, he never would have been president in the first place. But then again, if people in the Justice Department in New York State had actually enforced the laws on Trump as a businessman, he never would have gotten as far as he got. We've always had two laws in this country: one for rich people and one for everybody else, right? If they didn't enforce the law properly, he never would have gotten Republican nomination. So this is overdetermined, in other words, as social scientists like to say. But yeah, these cleavages inside the Trump administration, they're going to get worse. Now, a lot of people are thinking that Susie Wiles will be the chief of staff, that she might be able actually to control this. I'm skeptical. I don't know how long it's gonna last, but I think there's going to be a lot of noise coming out of this administration. A lot of people thrown out or bailing. I think it's going to be musical chairs for a while. I don't think the president's going to be able to really stabilize it and control it. I think it's going to be a clown show. Not a very nice one. A lot of people are going to be harmed by it. But I think this is going to be a huge mess, a huge, nasty mess.
Thank you, Adam. We've already come to the end of today's webinar, so I really do want to thank both you and our audience for being part of this webinar. And please, right, sort of subscribe to RSI events so you can join us for other forthcoming events. And once again, right, sort of, Adam, thank you very much for a very interesting webinar. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our webinar, right? Enjoy the rest of your day. And Adam, I know you're way past your bedtime, right? So.
Oh man. Yeah, I'm sorry I spoke so long. I tried to keep it short, but I just didn't. Did I? Sorry.
Thank you.